Now I find myself in Florida. I can't afford to go to the school that I was thinking about, and I finally, as I said previously, decided to go sailing again. So I went out and started shopping, boat shopping, that is. I drove around a bit on the East Coast, went as far as Texas and up and down the East Coast, and finally settled on a Cape Dory 28 that was for sale in Virginia on the Chesapeake Bay. Uh, I thought the guy wanted a little too much money for it. I made a lower offer, which he accepted. Now, I knew the boat was going to need some work, and it was going to certainly need some upgrade work to be suitable for my intended purpose. What I didn't realize at the time was just exactly how much work it was going to be. So I bought a new small flatbed trailer essentially and added some support arms to it to hold the boat. Made a trip up to Virginia, rented a car, found somebody that wanted to crew, or I didn't go looking for them, they volunteered, to have that offshore sailing experience. And I took off from Virginia. I didn't want to go back down through the intercoastal waterway, too long a trip that way, and I decided to go offshore. So sailed the boat back down to Jacksonville. Had a little bit of a harrowing time with the southwest. A whole gale went through for a little bit less than a day, but eventually made it down to Jacksonville, and I had prearranged a place in a marina to take the boat to and haul it out of the water and put it on my trailer to take back to my house. And that started a long process, more involved and longer in duration than I had originally planned. But 15 months later, the boat was ready to go. I took it down to the water, relaunched it, got a slip in a marina for a month or something like that. Didn't really have any time, or yeah, I did. I did have time. I did a very short shakedown cruise. Came back, also did that with a crew, somebody that wanted that offshore sailing experience again. Anyway, brought the boat back, bought provisions, sold my pickup truck, rented out the house, and I set off too late in the season. It was May, and by May I actually should have already been, at least in the Marquesas, if not the Tuamotus. But be that as it may, I took off in May and headed for Panama, uh, out of Jacksonville, Florida. Now, conditions were such that ran into a lot of no wind and was running the motor quite a bit and gobbling up fuel. I didn't have a great deal of capacity, but fortunately, I had contact on the ham radio with the ham operator in Jamaica, and he arranged to have all the officials present when I got in there to refuel. So I went in there, stayed for 3 or 4 days, and he took me around to a couple of local places, bought some more diesel fuel, and headed out for Panama again. Really didn't have too much problems. Got down to Panama. In those days, you could still anchor in the flats. I met Al Lean, a very interesting man who was circumnavigating on the North Sea 27, and he had had a heart and kidney transplant, and he was promoting a nonprofit organization that encouraged people to support organ transplants. Anyway, quite an interesting guy. He did finish his circumnavigation back in San Diego, which is where he started from. Anyway, I got down to the Galapagos, sailed across westward to the Marquesas. Well, it had a pretty good passage, 3,000 miles in 22 days on a 28-foot boat. But it was late in the season, so I couldn't spend a lot of time like I had done on Magi. So I only stayed there for a short period of time, got out of there, went to Rangiroa. It was basically nobody there because it was not already past the normal vacation season. Left Rangiroa. I wanted to go to Papeete in Tahiti, but by the time I got to that longitude, there was a very strong southerly wind blowing, and I didn't want to do like a day's worth of beating into a 15, 20 knot headwind and 6 to 8 foot seas just to get down to Papeete. So I continued westwards to Raiatea. Same thing. It's still kind of late in the season. I don't want to dally anywhere too much. I need to keep pushing west. So I left Raiatea. I didn't go to Bora Bora this time. I headed straight out to Rarotonga in the Cook Islands. Well, on the way there, I ran into a gale for 3 days. I wound up hove to, just drifted around in a big circle about a day and a half away from Rangiroa, which actually turned out to be not so bad because the only harbor in Rarotonga, is on the north side of the island. It's man-made, blasted out of the coral. And when the gale started, it was blowing from the north right into that little harbor area. And I heard from someone that I met there. There was only one boat left when I finally arrived. There were 22 boats in that harbor with lines and anchors going everywhere, trying to keep the boats from getting bashed into each other or the seawalls. Anyway, I spent a couple of days there, headed out, went up to Aitutaki, a place that I had passed by previously. It's up in the northern Cook Islands. Spent some very pleasant time there, headed off. Wanted to go to Suvarov again, so a couple of days away, went over to Suvarov. Had a good time there, really enjoyed it. It's one of my favorite places, Suvarov. Then took off from Suvarov and went to American Samoa because a good place to reprovision, getting up on the sailing season, getting more in sync with being in the right place at the right time. So I took off from there after provisioning the boat and, of course, doing a little boat work here and there. Headed down to a little tiny island country called Niue. Spent some time there, very interesting. Saw a couple of whales. And then headed down to Tonga. Spent a little bit of Tonga in the northern end of the Tonga group. I didn't go down to the southern end. And then sailed across to Suva in Fiji. Spent a little bit of time there. And by that time, people were making the run down, if they were going that way anyway, either across to Australia all the way or down to New Zealand, which is where I wanted to go. And I took off from Fiji, had a very pleasant 10-day or so, sailed down to Whangarei Harbor in New Zealand, although the last day was a bit of a challenge because there was a southwester came through. Then I wound up staying there through cyclone season, so I was there about 5 months or a little bit more. Between Whangarei and then a little bit towards the end, I went up to Opua in the Northern Island and cleared out there and sailed over to Australia to check out Australia. Anyway, I got there, went up the river in, what was that? Was it Brisbane? And went to a marina up there and stayed for a period of time. Sailed back downriver after running aground in the river bed a couple of times, both going up river and downriver. Nothing hurt because it's all mud. And continued up the northeast coast of Australia, rounding the top and Cape York. Came back down to a little town called Sasha on the northwest coast of Australia. Then sailed all the way across to Darwin, Australia. Spent a little bit of time there trying to arrange to get up through Indonesia, which turned out to be a real annoyance as they were still doing these cruiser get-together sail through where they had an organization that took care of all the check-in and check-out procedures, which was quite complicated at that time, still much more difficult than it is today. And but they wanted $750 US for that. I couldn't see the point in doing that. So I went up and sailed through Indonesia on my own. I wasn't cleared legally into the country, so really couldn't stop anywhere. I mean, I anchored a few times, but sailed up through, eventually went to Singapore. And while it was quite nice, I went up there to Raffles Marina, a bit expensive, but they had great shopping. I was able to provision there, get some more diesel fuel, all the normal things like that. And then headed out from Singapore, going up the Malaysian peninsula on the western side, kind of harbor hopping my way up. Now, of course, I'm doing all this single-handed, solo sailing. Got all the way up to Langkawi, and went in the marina there and stayed in Langkawi, and wound up having a great time there. I had previously met in one of the other Malaysian islands that couple that was on the boat in Rarotonga when I first arrived, and we became pretty friendly. Spent quite a bit of time together, often going almost every night to one of the local little restaurants to get a meal. And the owner of the boat, he had to fly back to Holland for a while to take care of some real estate thingy, and his girlfriend stayed behind, and we would go out to one place to eat one night, and then go to what my favorite was, kind of there was a Kentucky Fried Chicken there. We'd go there the next night. Did that for a number of weeks while he was gone. Anyway, got done with all that, and of course by this time I've well caught up with the proper season to make the transits through these different areas, so not having any problems with weather or anything. Anyway, left Langkawi, went up to Thailand, Phuket, spent a little bit of time in Phuket, and then headed out across the Indian Ocean. And I went and stopped in Malé, in the Maldives, because it was a duty-free port. And I primarily went there because my autopilot had stopped working, and I wanted to have a new one shipped there, and it was supposed to be duty-free. I had to get into a little discussion with customs there, but eventually they gave me my autopilot and didn't charge me anything on the customs fee. And anyway, I took off from there, sailed to the Seychelles, and had a pretty good time there. Met a guy that I had previously met in Mali. He was there, a Frenchman on this boat, not much bigger than mine, 30, 33 feet, something like that. And we palled around together. And in those days, Seychelles were a pretty decent place to go, although they did have a daily harbor usage fee, which I thought was a little absurd because they didn't make any real provisions. There were no moorings or anything put in there, but it was not outrageously expensive. Anyway, I wound up staying there for some time and then headed out to Mayotte. Now, Mayotte was great, French island. I managed to rescue a Frenchman on his boat coming back from Kenya to Mayotte, and he had a real bad leaking problem with his stuffing box. And it had drowned his batteries. He couldn't start the motor, and even if he could start it, he couldn't run it because of the leak situation. So he couldn't run the motor, and he and his wife and another couple and a young fellow from Madagascar as a crew. There were 5 people on a boat that was 33 or 35 feet long. And they were running out of everything because they tried to sail there from Kenya, and they had very light conditions. And so they'd been out at sea for like 3 weeks on something that should have been about a 1 week passage. Anyway, I offered them a tow with my little 28-foot boat, 12 horsepower diesel, and towed them into the lagoon. And they got situated. His name was Jean Paul. Very pleasant guy. Bought me 5 gallons of diesel, which of course was, being in a French area, was outrageously expensive. But I much appreciated the diesel fuel. And he helped me with the check-in too, because of course he had spent a lot of time in my yacht and was French, of course, spoke fluent French. Then I took off from my yacht and headed to Richards Bay in South Africa. And I got there on the first day of winter, June 21st, and it was cold for me anyway. So I wound up spending quite a bit of time there, about 2.5 months, because by now, instead of being behind schedule, I was ahead of schedule. And did a bunch of boat work, hauled the boat, repainted the bottom, pulled the engine out, put it in the cockpit, cleaned it up, and repainted it, reinstalled it. And hung around with the people in the Richards Bay Yacht Club, had a great time. Zululand Yacht Club, where I learned about some of the ins and outs of rugby, because they were having their national championship games there. So that I had a great time there. And then eventually I took off and started heading south down the notorious east coast of South Africa. Well, I got down to Durban. That was a bit of a challenge. I had to turn around and go back a couple times because of southwesters. But, oh no, I'm sorry. I got down to Durban pretty easily because it's only about 90 miles. When I left Durban, trying to get down to Port Elizabeth, I think, that's when I had the problems with the weather. But eventually I did get down there, got down to East London, Port Elizabeth, and kept harbor hopping down the coast. I think I went into Mossel Bay and then eventually into Simonstown. And wound up staying there for a bit of time. Once again, doing boat work of various kinds, just maintenance stuff. But enjoying the people there. I turned 60 years old when I was there. And the people treated me royally up at the restaurant and the yacht club. I couldn't buy a meal or buy a drink. They took me out and gave me a big birthday party that night in the bar, which was great. And I hadn't planned to stay there that long, but because the weather, the southeast winds were blowing so strong, and in False Bay, it was blowing like 35, 40 knots every day, trying to get out of that bay against the headwind of that strength would have been futile. So I just sat there and kind of enjoyed myself, intermingling with the people in the yacht club. Most everybody was quite pleasant, had a good time there, and with one eye on the weather. Well, eventually it did change, and it looked like I might have a window. So I set off about the middle of November and was able to get myself out of False Bay, even though the wind was still fairly strong, up in the 20 to 25 knot range, sailing with the double reef main and a reef in the staysail, tacking to get out of the harbor. But once I got out of the harbor, I say, but it was a bay actually, once I got out of False Bay and got around the Cape Horn Island, the weather really moderated and turned in my favor. And then I started heading up the west coast of South Africa. Of course, I was quite well offshore in the first couple of days, a very strong wind from astern, and was sailing the boat with the pulled out staysail, or the pulled out single reef in staysail, and knocking out 145 and 150 mile days on my 28-foot boat. Big seas, but since the current and the wind were from the same direction, they weren't dangerous, just large. Eventually that gave way and conditions moderated quite a bit, and I went into St. Helena, spent a little bit of time there. That was before they had provisions for boats, and I was anchored out way too deep of water. So I didn't stay there too long because of that, and I was anxious to get underway again. Then I headed up to Ascension. Same thing, got an anchor out, but had a very pleasant sail going up there. Very light, 8 to 10 knot conditions, often sailing with the drifter and the asymmetrical spinnaker, almost dead downwind going up to the north-northwest to Ascension. Anyway, I only spent a couple days there because there's nothing there really. It's just this cable relay station. At least back then, that was 2008, I believe. After Ascension, I headed out a little bit southwest, not southwest, over to Salvador in Brazil, along the Brazilian coast. There I met again Tim and his wife Jess, who I had first met in Richards Bay and then again in Simonstown. He's an Australian man, and his wife's a Filipina. And Tim designed and built his own real go-fasty aluminum catamarans. Was later on building them in the Philippines for quite a few years. Anyway, they invited me to come visit them in the Philippines, and I said, well, that's kind of my long-range plan eventually, if I get back and sell Phoenix, is to get another boat and head out across the Pacific again, which I managed to do about 3 years later. Got to Cebu in the Philippines. Anyway, I had to get a visa in South Africa to Brazil, and I was a little shocked at the charge for the visa. It was about 3 times the price that I had paid for a visa to any other country. And they said that's because of their reciprocal policy. That's what the U.S. charges for a visa application to go to the U.S., so they charge the same amount to American citizens who want a visa to Brazil. I kept my comments to myself. Anyway, stayed there for a while in Salvador and had rather a tough time getting out of there and heading north because the wind and the current was coming down the coast. But eventually, by doing a couple of long tacks offshore, I was able to get away from the coastal influence of the southwest setting current and got up to Natal. That was my last port in Brazil and where I cleared out, and also where I happened to get the worst case of, I guess it was sometimes called Montezuma's revenge, kind of like dysentery. It left me so weak with the heat and humidity there that I could barely walk. I managed to get myself to a pharmacy and talked to the pharmacist. They recommended something. I bought it, started taking it, and that seemed to fix the problem, although it took a number of days, and I had to leave because my visa was getting ready to expire. So the first couple days out of Natal, I was not operating at 100%. Anyway, from Natal, I sailed up to St. Lucia. Went in the marina there to treat myself because it had been a fairly long passage up from South Africa altogether. But $20. Now remember, this is 2009. $20 for pizza, $9 for cheeseburger was a little steep, I thought. So I didn't stay there too long, and I headed out again. Went up to the U.S. Virgin Islands and checked in to the U.S. again. So then it was just a matter of getting from there back up to Florida. Now, I wasn't going to go back to Jacksonville. I had reason to go to the Tampa area, so that's the way I was headed. On the way, I stopped in Puerto Rico and happened to run into somebody quite accidentally. Not literally run into them, but meet this man who eventually wound up buying Phoenix. Anyway, I left Puerto Rico. Uh, Once again, my autopilot wasn't working. I found out much later that it was a simple break in the power feed wire. Could have fixed it myself if I'd have known what was wrong. But, I thought it was something with the electronics. Anyway, took off from there, sailed back from Puerto Rico up north of Cuba, went around the west end of the Bahamas. And of course, the last day or so out, I ran into a northeast gale coming up on the west side of the Bahamas. And I was concerned because I didn't want it to blow me too far to the west and miss getting into Key West. Well, it worked out okay, but it was still pretty feisty out there for, more than half a day anyway. I mean, it was a whole gale. I was getting 35 to 50 knot winds. But being in the lee of the Bahamas, the seas weren't too bad. Anyway, the wind finally tapered off. That northeaster calmed down a bit, and I got into Key West okay. And I thought, what the heck, since I'm here, I might as well go have a cheeseburger in paradise. So I went ashore in the dinghy, got a cheeseburger in Jimmy Buffett's restaurant there. I was unimpressed. And then went back after my 2-day or so stay at Key West, hopped on the boat, headed back up to Tampa, which was an easy passage until the very last couple of hours. As I made the entrance into Tampa Bay and heading basically east in Tampa Bay to go through a very narrow channel to go up a river there, sure enough, this huge thunderstorm builds from the southeast, and it's blowing directly out of the channel, which is quite narrow and quite shallow, and even in my little 28-foot boat, not a place you could short tack or anything like that. And the wind was blowing so strong that there was no way I could power into it in keeping the boat in this little channel. So I was really fried because I should have made it that afternoon easily, but I wound up having to anchor, maybe 100, 150 feet from the entrance to that channel for the night and let that southeast squall, thunderstorm, lightning everywhere, blow itself out. Then I got up early in the morning and calmly putted up through the channel, got up into the Manatee River, and went into the first place that I saw, which was the Sneed Island Boatworks. And got there early on a Sunday morning. I managed to find a guy who was actually the yard manager, and he was quite pleasant. Turned out we had some common background. Anyway, he got me into a slip, got me tied up. I contacted my family who were down there. That's the reason I went there. They lived nearby. And came back, unloaded the boat, contacted a guy that wanted to buy the boat. He came, sent me a check, bought the boat, and I turned it over to him. And that was the end. Almost, I think, 35 months to do a circumnavigation, about 32,000 miles solo. And that's pretty much it for that.